Truth never arrives gently. It confronts us, strips us, demands that we finally look at what we spend a lifetime avoiding. Socrates revealed this long before our world fractured into noise. He insisted that ignorance is not a flaw, but the doorway, the only honest beginning of a conscious life. And the moment he declared that he knew nothing, he exposed the lie that humanity still clings to. We fear not the unknown, but the collapse of the illusions that protect us. Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. Yet the philosophical fire he ignited did not stay in the distant past. Even before modern psychology emerged, even before the intellectual turbulence of the early 20th century, Socrates had already mapped the terrain of inner conflict. The fragile ego, the defensive mind, the self that hides from its own depths. And as we move closer to 2025, his challenge sharpens. Knowledge accumulates, but self-understanding dissolves. Information multiplies, but clarity thins. This outline steps directly into that tension. It confronts the architecture of the examined life and follows the descent from illusion into awareness. Each chapter extends Socrates into our interior world. How we question, why we deceive ourselves, what moral clarity demands, and why an unexamined life still corrodes the soul. The path ahead is not gentle. It asks for sincerity, precision, and the willingness to dismantle what no longer holds truth. And with that, we move toward the body of the work, where philosophy becomes a tool not for date, speculation, but for transformation. Wisdom does not begin with knowledge. It begins with the violent collapse of certainty. Before systems were built, before universities canonized thought, before psychology named the mechanisms of the mind, Socrates stood in the marketplace of Athens and declared something that still unsettles the human ego. He did not know. That confession was not modesty. It was intellectual detonation. In a world that rewarded rhetorical dominance and public certainty, he stripped himself of the illusion of knowing and exposed the naked structure of human ignorance. Why is admitting ignorance the most courageous act a person can perform? Because the ego survives on the appearance of coherence. It feeds on the story that we understand who we are, what we believe, and why we act. To say I do not know is to fracture that story. It is to confront the terrifying possibility that much of what governs our decisions is unexamined inheritance, borrowed conviction, or defensive fabrication. Socrates revealed that ignorance is not the absence of information. It is the illusion of understanding. Long before modern cognitive science mapped biases and distortions, Socrates identified the most dangerous human condition: unconscious certainty. When the world still believed that wisdom was accumulation, he saw that wisdom was subtraction. He dismantled assumptions in public dialogue, not to humiliate, but to liberate. His method was surgical. He would ask a simple question, then another, then another. Each answer exposed contradiction. Each contradiction revealed the fragility of the supposed knowledge. And in that exposure, something radical occurred. The individual was forced to confront himself. Ignorance in the Socratic sense is not stupidity. It is self-deception unrecognized. First, ignorance hides beneath intellectual pride. A person believes he understands justice because he can define it. He believes he understands love because he can describe it. But definitions are not comprehension. They are labels placed over complexity. Socrates dismantled this confusion. To know the name of a thing is not to grasp its essence. To repeat a belief is not to understand its foundation. The common misunderstanding is that information equals insight. It does not. Insight demands the willingness to question the ground one stands on. Without that, knowledge is decoration. Second, ignorance is protected by psychological defense. Modern psychology speaks of defense mechanisms, rationalizations, cognitive distortions. Socrates diagnosed their primitive form through dialogue. When cornered by contradiction, his interlocutors did not celebrate discovery. They resisted, they evaded, they redefined terms. The ego does not surrender easily. It fears dissolution. To admit ignorance threatens identity. If I do not know what justice is, what else have I misunderstood? If my beliefs collapse, who am I? The fear is not about ideas, it is about the self. Third, ignorance persists because comfort is more seductive than truth. To live without questioning is easier. It allows continuity and avoids the anxiety of uncertainty. Socrates understood that examined living is destabilizing. It demands intellectual humility. It demands moral accountability. It demands that one stop blaming fate, society, or circumstance, and instead ask, what is my role in my own confusion? The misunderstanding is that questioning creates chaos. In truth, unexamined certainty breeds deeper disorder. Today, despite technological sophistication, the condition remains unchanged. Information has multiplied. Wisdom has not. We inhabit an era where answers are immediate and reflection is rare. We scroll, we react, we declare opinions within seconds. Yet how often do we interrogate the origin of those opinions? How often do we confront the possibility that our convictions are inherited scripts from family, culture, algorithm, or fear? Modernity has not solved ignorance. It has amplified its camouflage. The illusion of knowing is now reinforced by endless validation. In 2025, data saturates consciousness, but self-knowledge remains scarce. We measure productivity, track performance, optimize habits. But do we question the values driving those metrics? Do we examine the motives behind our ambition? Or do we hide behind busyness to avoid the more unsettling inquiry? What if I do not understand myself at all? Existential psychology reveals a painful truth. Much of human behavior is avoidance. We avoid anxiety by constructing narratives of control. We avoid uncertainty by clinging to rigid beliefs. We avoid freedom by submitting to predefined roles. Socrates demanded confrontation. He stripped away the protective layers and exposed the core ignorance beneath, not to shame, to awaken. At the deepest level, the refusal to admit ignorance is a refusal to be free. Freedom is not the ability to choose among options. It is the ability to see clearly what one is choosing. If my choices are driven by unconscious assumptions, I am not free. I am conditioned. To admit ignorance is to admit that my framework may be flawed. That admission opens space. In that space, reflection begins. In reflection, autonomy becomes possible. The fear of ignorance is fundamentally the fear of groundlessness. When certainty dissolves, there is a moment of vertigo. Nothing feels stable. This is the existential abyss described centuries later by thinkers who recognized that human beings crave foundations. Yet Socrates stepped willingly into that abyss. He demonstrated that stability built on illusion is weakness. Stability built on examined understanding is strength. Consider the symbolic figure of Socrates at his trial. Accused of corrupting the youth and impiety, he did not retreat into self-preservation through flattery. He maintained his stance. Questioning is necessary. Through him, we see the essence of intellectual integrity. He would rather die than abandon the commitment to examination. This is not martyrdom for drama. It is the embodiment of a principle. A life without scrutiny is not worthy of the dignity of consciousness. His declaration that he knew nothing was not a literal confession of emptiness. It was a strategic revelation. He knew that recognizing ignorance is the first authentic movement of the mind toward truth. Through Socrates, we see that humility is not weakness. It is disciplined strength. It is the refusal to pretend. Modern individuals often interpret humility as low self-esteem. This is confusion. Low self-esteem diminishes the self. Socratic humility refines it. It separates what is genuinely known from what is assumed. It dismantles inflated self-concepts and replaces them with intellectual honesty. The result is not paralysis, it is clarity. At the psychological core, admitting ignorance confronts the ego with mortality. Not physical death, but symbolic death. The death of the image we hold about ourselves as competent, informed, in control. This symbolic death is painful. It destabilizes identity, but it is also regenerative. When the false self dissolves, space emerges for a more authentic self to form. Why do so many resist this process? Because ignorance provides certainty, and certainty provides comfort. To say I know shields one from doubt. To say I do not know invites vulnerability. Vulnerability exposes the possibility of error. Error threatens social standing. The chain is clear. Ignorance defended becomes identity defended. Socrates cut that chain. He did not offer doctrine, he offered disruption. Through relentless questioning, he revealed that most people live in conceptual sleep. They repeat moral slogans without understanding morality. They praise virtue without defining it. They condemn injustice without examining their own contradictions. The shock of dialogue forced awakening. Some responded with transformation, others with hostility. Exposure is rarely welcomed. Yet without exposure, growth is impossible. The examined life is not comfortable. It is rigorous. It requires that one interrogate motives, challenge inherited beliefs, and endure uncertainty. It requires intellectual courage. Courage not of the battlefield, but of the inner arena, the battlefield of thought, where the opponent is one's own assumption. Socrates positioned ignorance not as a flaw to hide, but as a doorway. Once acknowledged, it becomes fertile ground. Questions arise. Inquiry deepens. Dialogue refines thought. Gradually, a more coherent understanding forms. Not absolute certainty, but grounded awareness. The difference is decisive. One clings, the other explores. In the modern psyche, the refusal to admit ignorance manifests as overconfidence, polarization, defensiveness. We witness debates that generate heat, but not light. Each side defends its position as if survival depends on it. But what if the deeper survival instinct is the ego's need to avoid exposure? What if the intensity of argument conceals a fragile foundation? To confront ignorance is to confront limitation. It is to recognize that perception is partial, reasoning flawed, memory unreliable. This recognition is not despair, it is sobriety. Sobriety clears illusion. Illusion sustains delusion. Delusion distorts action. Thus, the path from ignorance to acknowledgement is the path from confusion to responsibility. Responsibility begins when excuses end. If I admit that I may not understand, I must investigate. If I investigate, I must revise. If I revise, I must change. Ignorance protected demands nothing. Ignorance exposed demands transformation. The first movement of wisdom, then, is not acquisition. It is surrender. Surrender of false certainty. Surrender of intellectual arrogance. Surrender of the comfort of unexamined belief. Only in that surrender does the mind become receptive. And yet, surrender is only the threshold. Once the illusion of knowing cracks, a deeper process unfolds. Questions multiply, assumptions unravel. The terrain of thought becomes unstable. In that instability, a new discipline is required. The discipline not merely to admit ignorance, but to use it as an instrument. For once the mask of certainty falls, the next challenge emerges with greater force. How to ask in a way that heals rather than destroys. How to interrogate without collapsing into nihilism. How to transform doubt into a method rather than a void. The question becomes the scalpel that carves through illusion. Once the confession of not knowing shatters the false ground beneath us, the mind enters a raw and exposed terrain. In that terrain, the question is no longer a request for information. It is an instrument of disruption. It demands clarity where certainty once stood unquestioned. It demands honesty where the ego once performed competence. It demands that the self dismantle the very architecture it believed protected it. The question does not comfort. The question confronts. And in that confrontation, something essential begins to heal. Before the world invented therapy, before cognitive science discovered distortion, before philosophy fractured into specialized disciplines, Socrates understood that the true function of a question is not to win an argument, but to open a mind. He recognized that the mind, left unexamined, calcifies. It forms rigid beliefs, unquestioned narratives, inherited convictions. The question is the solvent. It dissolves the hardened layers of assumption. It introduces space. It invites movement. It refuses to let the mind remain static. A question, when used with precision, performs three tasks at once. It reveals contradiction. It exposes avoidance. And it demands ownership. Revelation, exposure, ownership. This triad is the engine of transformation. Without these three, thought remains mechanical, ego-driven, defensive. Socrates did not ask questions to trap others. He asked to awaken. But awakening is violent. It disrupts inner equilibrium. It forces the self to revise its foundations. That revision is the beginning of healing. The essence of the Socratic question is not interrogation, it is provocation. It provokes thought to turn inward. It provokes assumptions to collapse. It provokes the individual to see not only what he believes, but how he believes. The modern world teaches people to accumulate answers. Socrates taught them to endure questions. The difference is profound. Answers stabilize. Questions destabilize. And only in destabilization does the possibility of change emerge. Long before cognitive therapy formalized techniques of challenging distorted beliefs, Socrates identified the same mechanisms: catastrophizing, projection, rationalization, confirmation bias. These are not modern discoveries. They are ancient human habits. Socrates encountered them in every conversation. When a person was forced to articulate his belief, he defended it not with clarity, but with improvisation. He twisted meaning. He avoided precision. He softened contradictions with vague language. Socrates noticed the pattern. The mind protects itself by distorting truth. The question cuts through those distortions. What do you mean by that? How do you know? Is your conclusion consistent with your premise? What follows if your claim is true? What collapses if it is not? These are not attacks, they are invitations. Each question forces a deeper descent. Each answer becomes a mirror, reflecting back the structure of thought. And the moment the structure is exposed, the individual must confront whether it is coherent or merely convenient. Modern psychology affirms this process. When a person examines a belief with disciplined questioning, neural pathways shift. The rigid association between thought and reaction loosens. A new interpretation becomes possible. The mind becomes less automatic, more deliberate. This is healing at the cognitive level. But Socrates went beyond cognition. His method sought healing at the existential level. He used questioning to restore the soul to alignment with truth. A belief that cannot survive a question is a belief that harms the one who holds it. This principle stands at the core of Socratic inquiry. To protect a belief from scrutiny is to chain oneself to it. To expose a belief to inquiry is to reclaim authority over it. In this sense, questioning is an act of liberation. It tears away dependency. It returns power to the individual. It signals the shift from passively inheriting thought to actively shaping it. But why does the question heal? Because it demands presence. Because it interrupts mental autopilot. Because it forces consciousness to confront itself. Healing begins the moment avoidance ends. Most internal suffering today is not caused by lack of knowledge, but by lack of examination. A person lives with unchallenged assumptions about worth, success, identity, failure, love, mortality. These assumptions operate invisibly. They dictate behavior, emotion, and expectation. The result is friction. The friction becomes anxiety. The anxiety becomes narrative. The narrative becomes self. But none of it is interrogated. None of it is chosen. Socrates would ask, "Who told you this? Why do you believe it? What evidence supports it? What fear sustains it? What happens if you release it?" Such questions destabilize the illusion of inevitability. They reveal that many internal chains are self-forged. They expose the mind to its own agency. And agency, once recognized, is the seed of freedom. The question does not give answers. It creates conditions for answers to emerge. This is why the Socratic method is fundamentally therapeutic. Not because it solves problems, but because it dismantles the mental structures that prevent genuine insight. Modern cognitive therapy calls this cognitive restructuring. Socrates practiced it centuries before the terminology existed. When a belief is examined rigorously, its distortions surface. When distortions surface, they lose power. When power dissolves, the self expands. Healing is expansion. Ignorance is contraction. The question is the force that breaks the contraction. Yet questioning is not merely intellectual, it is ethical. Socrates believed that clarity of thought leads to clarity of action. A confused mind produces confused behavior. An examined mind produces intentional behavior. The question becomes the link between thought and virtue. It extracts the truth behind the motive. It exposes the shadow behind the desire. It forces the self to confront its own contradictions in moral reasoning. The ethical dimension arises because every question is ultimately self-directed. Even when posed to another, the inquiry reflects back onto the one who asked it. The question becomes a universal solvent. It dissolves pretense. It dissolves arrogance. It dissolves false confidence. What remains is humility sharpened into awareness. This is why the question is both weapon and remedy. It cuts, and in cutting, it heals. But there is a deeper layer still. The question restructures the inner world. It changes the architecture of thought. Once a person internalizes the questioning stance, he no longer accepts appearances at face value. He no longer trusts the first impulse. He no longer obeys inherited conviction. A new habit forms, the habit of reflection. Reflection becomes instinct. Instinct becomes identity. Identity becomes freedom. In this sense, the Socratic question is not a technique. It is a way of being. However, embracing this way of being requires the courage to withstand uncertainty. The question destabilizes. It removes the scaffolding of unexamined beliefs. It creates an inner void. But this void is not emptiness. It is possibility. It is the open space in which a more coherent self can form. Avoidance seeks to fill the void with quick answers. Inquiry teaches one to endure the void long enough for truth to emerge. But truth does not emerge for the faint-hearted. It emerges for the one willing to remain exposed. In 2025, uncertainty terrifies the modern individual more than ever. Complexity overwhelms. Information floods consciousness. People crave closure. They fear ambiguity. They seek instant answers. In this climate, questioning becomes radical. To stop and ask why in a world addicted to speed is an act of rebellion. To question one's own beliefs in an era of ideological polarization is an act of inner sovereignty. The crisis of the modern psyche is not ignorance of facts. It is the inability to interrogate the self. Socrates foresaw this psychological erosion long before digital distraction or social comparison existed. He understood that without questioning, the soul decays. It becomes reactive, impulsive, unanchored. The question restores order. It slows the mind. It forces orientation. It demands a movement from superficial reaction to deliberate interpretation. And yet, even with all this, one truth remains. Questioning alone is not enough. It awakens, it disturbs, it illuminates. But the illuminated mind must then confront the deeper problem. Why does the human being hide from himself, even when the truth stands exposed? Why does clarity not always lead to transformation? Why does awareness collapse back into denial? There lies the next threshold, where self-deception begins its relentless war against wisdom. Self-deception is the quiet architect of human suffering. It operates not in the shadows outside us, but in the dim corridors within, where the mind manufactures stories to protect itself from truths it does not want to confront. What appears as confusion on the surface is often only the residue of a deeper refusal. We do not misunderstand the world as much as we misunderstand ourselves. And the most violent truth of all is this: the human being is capable of extraordinary clarity, yet chooses blindness when clarity threatens identity. Before Freud drew maps of repression and the unconscious, before Jung spoke of shadows and archetypes, Socrates already saw that the greatest barrier to wisdom is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. He recognized that the mind does not merely fail to see, it actively constructs blindness. It invents explanations, justifies impulses, edits memory, rationalizes contradiction. It becomes both prisoner and warden, locking itself away while declaring itself free. And when confronted with truth, it does not yield. It defends, it attacks, it retreats. This is the paradox at the heart of human cognition. We claim to seek truth, yet instinctively flee from it when it threatens the narratives that hold our identity together. Socrates stepped directly into this paradox. He confronted individuals not with accusations, but with questions that destabilized their certainty. They believed they understood justice, courage, virtue. They believed their inner world was consistent. But as soon as they were led through their own reasoning, the fractures appeared. They contradicted themselves. They shifted definitions. They abandoned principles the moment those principles trapped them. In each dialogue, Socrates revealed the same fundamental pattern. The self protects itself from self-knowledge. Freud would later call this defense. Jung would call it shadow avoidance. Cognitive science would call it bias. But the mechanism is ancient. A person does not simply misinterpret reality. He edits his internal world to preserve coherence, even if that coherence is false. There are three primary forms of this self-deception that Socrates exposed with ruthless clarity. First, the mind confuses familiarity with understanding. To name something is to believe one has comprehended it. People say justice as if the word captures the essence. They say virtue as if repetition equals mastery. But naming is only recognition, not insight. The illusion deepens because language masks ignorance. A person speaks fluently about concepts he has never interrogated. The fluency becomes armor. The armor becomes prison. Second, the mind confuses opinion with knowledge. Socrates encountered this repeatedly. A citizen confidently asserts a belief. When challenged, the belief collapses. Yet the confidence persists. The individual clings to certainty, not because the belief is grounded, but because uncertainty is intolerable. Freud later identified this as ego defense. The belief protects the self, not the truth. Modern psychology observes the same. Once a belief becomes part of identity, evidence cannot easily dislodge it. The self defends the belief as if defending its own existence. Third, the mind confuses inner desire with objective truth. When a person wants something to be true, he perceives it as true. Desire becomes lens. Fear becomes filter. The unconscious shapes perception long before conscious reasoning begins. Jung described this as projection, what we refuse to acknowledge. Within ourselves, we cast onto the world. Socrates saw it centuries earlier, in every argument shaped more by emotion than by logic. These three illusions intertwine into a single force: the avoidance of self-confrontation. The danger is not that people do not know. The danger is that they refuse to see the mechanisms by which they deceive themselves. Self-deception becomes identity. Identity becomes fate. In the modern age, this condition has only deepened. In the era of rapid information, people believe themselves informed. They mistake access for comprehension. They mistake awareness for insight. They mistake emotional certainty for truth. The noise of the world becomes an internal fog through which the self wanders without orientation. In 2025, the individual is surrounded by commentary, yet starved of introspection. He knows facts, yet remains a stranger to his own motives. Socrates would say, You are not suffering from lack of knowledge. You are suffering from lack of examination. But why is self-examination so rare? Why does a person resist knowing himself, even when the evidence of confusion is undeniable? The answer lies in the architecture of the psyche. To know oneself requires descent. Descent into fear, into contradiction, into the disowned parts of the self. Such descent threatens the ego's illusion of unity. The ego wants to believe it is consistent, rational, good. Self-knowledge reveals the instability beneath. It exposes impulses that contradict moral aspiration. It uncovers desires one does not want to admit. It reveals dependency, envy, frailty, aggression. It exposes the gap between who we are and who we claim to be. Thus, the psyche builds defense mechanisms to shield itself, not because it prefers ignorance, but because it fears annihilation. When Freud described repression, he was articulating in clinical language what Socrates demonstrated in dialogue. The psyche hides truth to preserve itself. When Jung described the shadow, was illuminating what Socrates saw in every human contradiction. We condemn outwardly what we secretly fear within. When cognitive scientists describe biases, heuristics, distortions, they are merely tracing the same pattern. The mind preserves comfort at the cost of accuracy. Self-deception is not a flaw, it is a survival strategy. But what once protected becomes a cage. The tragedy is that the more a person deceives himself, the less control he has over his own life. He becomes governed by unconscious motives he refuses to acknowledge. He repeats patterns he claims to reject. He suffers consequences he insists came from the outside. Without self-knowledge, agency collapses. The individual becomes reactive, driven by forces he does not understand. Socrates insisted that the unexamined life is not merely unworthy, it is unfree. Freedom begins with the destruction of illusion. But destroying illusion is violent. It destabilizes identity. It forces reevaluation of values, motives, desires. It demands that a person stand naked before himself without justification. Most people flee this confrontation. They prefer the comfort of self-deception to the discomfort of truth. Yet something remarkable occurs when this confrontation is endured. Once the illusions crack, once the self glimpses its own contradictions, a new state emerges. Awareness sharpens. Intentionality strengthens. A person begins to sense the boundaries of his ignorance not as humiliation, but as possibility. The space created by shattered illusion becomes the ground for genuine identity. Socrates did not humiliate people. He liberated them. The collapse of their false certainty was the birth of their autonomy. The deeper reason self-deception persists is that the psyche wants coherence more than truth. But Socrates teaches that true coherence arises only after the false coherence has been dismantled. The self must be stripped down to its contradictions before it can be rebuilt with integrity. This stripping is terrifying, yet it is necessary. The modern world has developed countless ways to avoid this process. Distraction, productivity, performance, digital affirmation. The self is always looking outward to avoid looking inward. But avoidance compounds confusion. Confusion compounds suffering. Suffering eventually forces confrontation. And in that confrontation, Socratic truth returns. You cannot escape the self you refuse to know. This is why Freud claimed that the unconscious will speak whether one listens or not. Why Jung asserted that one does not become enlightened by imagining light, but by making the darkness conscious. Why cognitive therapists insist that thought must be examined before behavior can change. They are all echoing the same ancient insight. Clarity begins where deception ends. But something even more disturbing emerges when we look deeper. A person does not merely fail to know himself. He actively constructs an image to hide behind. This image becomes the self he presents to the world, the self he convinces himself he is. And once the image hardens, it becomes sacred. Any challenge to it feels like threat. Socrates exposed this image not to destroy dignity, but to restore authenticity. The moment the image cracks, the true self begins to breathe. Yet as soon as breathing begins, another force awakens, the desire to transform. For once one sees the truth of one's own contradictions, the next question rises with unavoidable urgency. Why do I act against my own understanding? Why do I betray what I claim to value? Why does knowledge not immediately become virtue? And with that question, the mind turns toward the next frontier, where clarity meets morality and thought becomes action. Error does not spring from malice. It springs from blindness. This was Socrates' most unsettling claim because it confronts the ego with a truth it resists. When we act against our own values, it is not because we choose evil, but because we do not truly see. We misperceive, we misunderstand, we misjudge. Wrongdoing emerges not from a corrupt heart, but from a clouded mind. And this single insight dismantles centuries of moral accusation. It reveals that most of what we call moral failure is in fact epistemic failure. We do not sin deliberately. We stumble because we are blind to what we are doing and blind to who we are while doing it. This is the point where the philosophical meets the psychological. The moment Socrates claimed that no one errs willingly, he was not denying responsibility. He was reframing it. Responsibility becomes the obligation to seek clarity. To fail at clarity is to fail at moral action. Thus, the ethical life begins long before the action itself. It begins in perception. It begins in understanding. It begins in the struggle against the ignorance that distorts judgment. Socrates saw this in every conversation. When someone acted unjustly, he always believed himself justified. The tyrant believes he is protecting stability. The liar believes he is avoiding harm. The selfish man believes he is preserving his own survival. Each action is wrapped in a narrative that protects the self from confronting its own confusion. If a person truly saw the full consequences of his action on himself, on others, on the structure of his own soul, he would not choose harm. Harm thrives only in partial vision. Centuries later, neuroscience affirms this. The brain does not choose based on objective truth. It chooses based on the interpretation of truth filtered through emotion, memory, bias, and fear. A distorted interpretation leads to a distorted action. When Socrates insisted that knowledge and virtue are inseparable, he anticipated this science. He recognized that clear seeing produces right action. Confused seeing produces contradiction. The modern world, however, treats morality as though it were primarily a matter of willpower. Be disciplined, be good, try harder, resist temptation. But moral effort, without moral insight, collapses under pressure. The will cannot sustain what the mind does not understand. When emotion surges or fear tightens its grip, the will obeys the strongest internal force, not the highest ideal. A person acts according to the clarity of his perception, not the loftiness of his aspiration. This is why Socrates insisted that wrongdoing is rooted in ignorance. Ignorance of consequences, ignorance of motives, ignorance of true benefit, ignorance of the self. If a person genuinely knew what was good, not merely believed it, not merely recited it, but knew it with the depth of embodied understanding, he would not choose its opposite. Knowledge transforms desire. It reshapes instinct. It aligns the psyche. But there is a deeper layer. Wrongdoing also reveals the fragmentation within the self. A person may intellectually grasp the good, yet still fail to perform it. Modern psychology explains this split. The cognitive mind and emotional mind do not always communicate. Trauma disrupts integration. Fear overrides reasoning. Habit pulls stronger than insight. The self becomes divided. Socrates, ahead of his time, recognized this fragmentation even without the vocabulary of neuroscience. When he spoke of the soul out of harmony, he was describing psychological division. A divided self cannot act with consistency. It knows, but does not obey its own knowledge. And yet, the moment such a person fails, he blames character rather than perception. He says, I am weak, I am flawed, I am corrupt. But Socrates redirects the gaze. Your actions reveal not your nature, but your confusion. Resolve the confusion, and the action will change. This view requires immense courage because it strips away excuses. If error is rooted in ignorance, then ignorance is not passive. It is a task, a burden, a responsibility. One must confront the roots of one's own blindness. One must examine thought, emotion, intention. One must interrogate what one believes is good and why one believes it. The ethical life is not obedience to rules, but the pursuit of lucidity. Modern neuroscience reinforces this principle. The prefrontal cortex regulates judgment, impulse, and moral decision-making. When emotional circuits dominate, clarity collapses. The person does not choose wrongdoing, he falls into it. But when understanding deepens, when consequences become vivid, when motives become transparent, when values become internal rather than imposed, the brain reorganizes. The pathways of action shift. Understanding is not abstract. It has physical consequence. It shapes the architecture of the mind. Thus, Socrates was not merely speaking metaphorically. Knowledge does not inspire virtue. it generates it. And ignorance does not permit vice, it produces it. Yet something remains unsettling. If all wrongdoing arises from not knowing, why do people resist knowing? Why does clarity provoke fear instead of relief? Why do individuals cling to confusion as though it were safety? The answer lies in the architecture of self-deception explored earlier. Knowing carries a cost. Knowledge demands change. To see clearly is to lose the comfort of illusion. A person may prefer distorted perception because distorted perception allows him to preserve his current identity. He can claim helplessness. He can claim external blame. He can claim that life happens to him rather than through him. To know is to be accountable. To be accountable is to be free. And freedom, despite its promise, terrifies. Socrates understood that the ethical struggle is not against wrongdoing. It is against the internal resistance to understanding. Once resistance dissolves, virtue rises naturally. The self aligns, the mind clarifies, the heart steadies, action becomes coherent. This is why moral laws fail without introspection. One can recite commandments, follow doctrines, adopt codes, yet when fear spikes or desire overwhelms, the code collapses. Only inner clarity survives pressure. Only the examined mind navigates temptation. Only understanding shapes action from the inside out. And so the true question is not, why do people do wrong? The true question is, why do people fear knowing what is right? The answer is simple. Knowledge transforms. Transformation disrupts. People fear the loss of the selves they have learned to inhabit. The dishonest man fears who he must become if he admits his dishonesty. The jealous woman fears the vulnerability beneath her envy. The cruel person fears the grief that would surface if he saw the truth of his own damage. Moral failure is rarely about intent. It is about unhealed places within the self, places that distort perception, places that cloud judgment, places that act long before thought intervenes. Socrates approached these places not with condemnation, but with illumination. His method did not punish the person for being wrong. It illuminated the process by which the person became wrong. In illumination, shame loses power. In illumination, possibility returns. When the source of error becomes visible, the mind can reorient itself toward truth. The modern individual in 2025 faces this same battle. Technology amplifies impulse. Speed eclipses reflection. People react before they understand what they are reacting to. They judge before they perceive. They choose before they know what they are choosing. In such an environment, the Socratic claim becomes more urgent than ever. Only knowledge produces right action, and only reflection produces knowledge. But reflection alone is not enough. One must descend deeper into the psychological forces that shape the inner world. For if the soul is divided, if rational will is not aligned with emotional instinct, then even the clearest moral vision fractures under pressure. The next task, then, is not simply to know the good, but to understand the internal structure that performs it or betrays it. And from this need arises the inquiry into the hidden architecture of the human psyche, the layered tensions between reason, emotion, and desire, and the ancient struggle to forge harmony within the self. Order is not a luxury of the soul, it is its condition for survival. When reason, emotion, and desire collide without alignment, the human being becomes a battlefield disguised as a personality. What appears as indecision, anxiety, or exhaustion is often only the surface tremor of a deeper structural conflict. Socrates understood this long before psychology named the layers of the mind. He saw that the self is not a single voice, but a chorus in constant negotiation. And when the voices fall out of harmony, suffering begins. The soul fractures not through catastrophe, but through contradiction. Reason pulls toward clarity. Emotion surges toward meaning. Desire strains toward satisfaction. Each force is necessary. Each serves a purpose. But when any one of them dominates, the inner world collapses into imbalance. A life led only by reason becomes cold, detached, and sterile. A life ruled only by emotion becomes volatile, impulsive, and reactive. A life driven only by desire becomes enslaved to endless craving. Harmony is not the suppression of these forces, but their orchestration. Socrates' insight that the well-ordered soul is the foundation of well-ordered living was not metaphysical speculation. It was psychological diagnosis. He saw that moral failure, confusion, and inner turmoil arise when these three capacities operate in isolation rather than synchrony. He taught that the rational part must guide, the emotional part must support, and the desiring part must follow. Not as hierarchy imposed by morality, but as alignment necessary for freedom. For without internal order, freedom becomes chaos disguised as choice. The modern world, however, has distorted this understanding. It encourages desire without discipline, emotion without grounding, intellect without purpose. The result is a human being stretched across conflicting impulses, unable to inhabit himself fully. This fragmentation is visible everywhere, in the restless acceleration of life, in the addiction to stimulation, in the inability to remain still without anxiety. People believe they suffer from circumstance, but more often they suffer from inner dissonance. In the language of contemporary psychology, the divided soul mirrors the divided psyche. Cognitive mechanisms battle with emotional conditioning. Instinct overrides reason. Reason suppresses emotion until emotion erupts. The individual becomes a system firing without integration. Neuroscience confirms what Socrates intuited. Coherent action arises only when the brain's reflective circuits are in dialogue with emotional and instinctive systems. When this dialogue breaks down, so does the self. But the soul does not fall into disorder without cause. Disorder arises through repeated avoidance. When a desire is indulged without reflection, it detaches from reason. When an emotion is ignored or shamed, it separates from understanding. When reason is used to justify rather than illuminate, it becomes a tool of deception rather than clarity. Each act of avoidance widens the internal divide, and so the individual begins to live in compartments. He thinks one thing, feels another, and does a third. The fracture becomes identity. The conflict becomes normal. But beneath the surface, exhaustion accumulates. The mind grows heavy, dragging its unintegrated parts behind it. Socrates insisted that harmony is not the product of control, but of insight. To understand each part of the soul is to understand one's own orientation toward life. Reason seeks the long view. Emotion seeks resonance. Desire seeks immediacy. All three are valid. All three must be acknowledged. The tragedy is that most people elevate one and exile the others. They praise rationality while suppressing emotion, or glorify emotion while abandoning discipline, or chase desire while ignoring. Consequence. This exile is the beginning of suffering. An emotion suppressed does not disappear, it mutates. It returns as anxiety, anger, or numbness. A desire indulged without examination does not satisfy. It escalates. It demands more, then more again. A rational mind, disconnected from feeling, does not illuminate. It freezes. It analyzes life instead of living it. The consequences of imbalance are not abstract. They shape the daily movements of the psyche. The greatest deception is the belief that one part of the self can be ignored without cost. Socrates demanded that the soul become a unified force, not perfect, but aligned, not controlled, but understood. This understanding begins by seeing the movements within the self without judgment. What do I desire and why? What emotion rises and what truth does it reveal? What does reason perceive when it is not distorted by fear or craving? To ask these questions is to unearth the architecture of the soul. Modern therapeutic models echo this approach. Emotion regulation teaches us not to suppress feeling, but to interpret it. Behavior psychology teaches us not to deny desire, but to integrate it into long-term meaning. Cognitive therapies teach us not to worship reason, but to refine it until it sees clearly rather than defensively. Harmony is not the elimination of conflict. It is the reduction of unnecessary tension through awareness. But harmony demands another form of courage, the willingness to confront the parts of oneself that resist integration. Desire resists discipline because discipline interrupts pleasure. Emotion resists reason because reason threatens its narrative. Reason resists emotion because emotion reveals vulnerability. Each part of the psyche fears the others. Each believes it must dominate or be consumed. Socrates saw that healing begins when these parts cease competing and begin conversing. The guiding power is not force, but comprehension. Yet comprehension alone is insufficient. The self must choose orientation. Reason must not impose tyranny, but it must lead. Emotion must not dictate action, but it must inform. Desire must not govern the soul, but it must be included. Exclusion is the beginning of distortion. Inclusion is the beginning of alignment. This principle has profound implications. A person who lives with internal harmony experiences stability independent of circumstance. External chaos does not shatter him because his inner structure is coherent. He does not react impulsively to emotion because emotion is in dialogue with reason. He does not drown in desire because desire is guided by purpose. He does not fracture when challenged because his internal parts support rather than sabotage one another. Harmony is not tranquility, it is strength. Socrates understood that happiness is not a feeling, but a state of structural integrity. When the parts of the soul operate as one, the individual no longer feels pulled apart. Action flows without inner resistance. Decisions feel grounded rather than conflicted. Joy becomes possible because the self no longer fights itself. This is the meaning of inner order, the reduction of internal friction. The modern individual rarely recognizes this. He seeks happiness through external acquisition, achievement, recognition, consumption, distraction. But these cannot soothe a divided soul. They intensify the division. The moment external stimulation fades, the internal chaos resurfaces. The self remains unintegrated. The person becomes dependent on external forces to drown the noise within. True happiness arises only when internal order is restored. But restoring order requires entering the space most people fear, the space where emotion speaks truth, desire reveals motive, and reason must confront what it has avoided. Integration demands honesty. Honesty demands exposure. Exposure demands endurance. Thus, inner order is not achieved by comfort, but by confrontation. Socrates offered no shortcuts because none exist. He demanded that each person examine the movements within the soul until they align with what is truly good. The good is not arbitrary. It is the state in which the self can act without betraying itself. Moral behavior is not imposed from outside. It emerges from inner harmony. A person who has integrated his emotional, rational, and desiring parts cannot easily act unjustly, because injustice fractures the soul that has worked to become whole. This is why inner order is both psychological and ethical. The self that is unified naturally extends that unity outward. Stability becomes fairness. Clarity becomes compassion. Integrity becomes justice. The individual becomes a microcosm of the world he hopes to live in. Disorder within radiates outward as disorder in action. Order within radiates outward as coherence in life. And yet, the pursuit of inner order reveals another unsettling truth. Even when the soul becomes aligned, the world around it may not be. External forces pull, distort, provoke. Society rewards desire, inflames emotion, and undermines reflection. A person may cultivate harmony within yet still find himself in conflict with a culture that thrives on division. Thus arises the next problem Socrates faced, and the modern world intensifies. How can a harmonized soul survive in a disordered world? And what becomes of a life that refuses to remain unexamined in an age built to prevent examination? A life that is not examined does not collapse in a single moment. It erodes, slowly, quietly, imperceptibly, until one day the person wakes and realizes he has been living not as himself, but as the sum of impulses, expectations, and distractions that have pulled him away from his own interior existence. Socrates warned of this centuries before the modern world perfected the machinery of distraction. He saw that the greatest human tragedy is not failure, not pain, not even death. It is unconscious living. It is the slow drift into a life that is not chosen, not understood, not inhabited. The unexamined life is not merely unworthy, it is uninhabited. Today the erosion is faster. Technology accelerates the drift. Attention is fragmented. The inner voice is drowned under layers of noise. People move through their days reacting more than choosing, consuming more than reflecting, performing more than living. In such an environment, the demand for examination becomes radical. To pause, to look inward, to interrogate one's own mind is an act of rebellion against the velocity of modern existence. And yet, without this rebellion, a person becomes a ghost inside his own life. The tragedy is not external chaos, it is internal abandonment. Socrates knew that the human being becomes lost not when the world overwhelms him, but when he stops asking where he is going and why he is moving at all. Without questioning, he becomes absorbed into the momentum of others. He begins to chase goals he never chose. He measures his worth by standards he never examined. He constructs a self from borrowed desires, and because it is borrowed, it collapses under the weight of expectation. In 2025, this collapse appears in subtle forms: restlessness that cannot be explained, fatigue that sleep does not cure, anxiety that rises without trigger, a persistent sense that something essential is being neglected. These symptoms are not signs of weakness, they are signals. Signals that the self has lost contact with itself. Signals that the inner world is no longer guiding the outer life. To examine one's life is not an academic exercise, it is survival. Socrates' claim is confrontational because it forces the individual to face a truth he has avoided. The mind, when unexamined, becomes an instrument of self-betrayal. It moves according to habit, fear, and imitation. It adopts opinions that feel comfortable rather than true. It commits to paths that silence the inner questioner. And the more one avoids reflecting, the deeper the disconnection grows. But why does the modern individual avoid this form of examination? Why does he resist the very act that could restore his inner coherence? Because stillness is dangerous. Silence is revealing. Reflection strips away the justifications and distractions that shield a person from confronting himself. When he slows down, he begins to hear the fracture within. The ignored emotion surfaces. The neglected longing speaks. The disowned contradiction demands attention. Reflection becomes the mirror that reveals the face behind the performance. Most people prefer the comfort of activity over the discomfort of clarity. The digital age intensifies this preference. With endless stimulation available at every moment, discomfort becomes avoidable. Waiting disappears. Boredom disappears. The gaps in which reflection once lived are filled with noise. The inner world becomes inaccessible, not because it is hidden, but because it is drowned. A person no longer knows his own thoughts because his mind is occupied with the thoughts of everyone else. And yet, despite this constant external occupation, an emptiness grows. An emptiness produced by the absence of interiority. A person does not feel lost because his life is chaotic. He feels lost because his life has drifted away from his soul. Socrates' warning that the unexamined life is not worth living must be understood in this context. Worth does not refer to material achievement or social recognition. It refers to the dignity of consciousness. A life without examination forfeits this dignity. The individual becomes a spectator rather than an author, a consumer rather than a creator, a reactor rather than a chooser. The examined life, however, reclaims authorship. To examine one's life is to ask, what drives me? What shapes my choices? What fears dominate my decisions? What desires distort my clarity? What values are truly mine and which have I absorbed from the world? These questions confront the illusions explored earlier. They disrupt the coherence of the false self. They expose the misalignment between what one claims to value and how one actually lives. And once exposed, contradiction becomes unbearable. The examined life cannot tolerate hypocrisy, not because of morality, but because of internal friction. When the mind sees clearly, it cannot return to blindness without suffering. Awareness demands coherence. Coherence demands alignment. Alignment demands transformation. This is the reason examination is feared. It disrupts the continuity of the unchosen life. It interrupts the convenience of self-deception. It forces a person to become responsible for his own existence. Responsibility is heavy. And in a world that offers endless escape routes, heaviness feels optional. But without carrying this weight, a person remains spiritually weightless. He floats through life without anchor, without depth, without direction. And in moments of crisis, he has nothing to hold on to because he has never built an interior foundation. Examination is the process of building that foundation, but the examined life requires more than reflection. It requires the courage to confront the discomfort that reflection reveals. Most people stop at the first layer. They observe their habits, their behaviors, their emotional reactions. But Socrates demands dissent. He demands that one interrogate why these patterns exist at all. He demands that the examination turn inward until the root of the psyche is uncovered. To examine the life is to examine the self. To examine the self is to examine the soul. To examine the soul is to confront its disorder. And once confronted, the work of integration begins. But integration is slow. It is painful. It is destabilizing. The examined life is not peaceful at first. It is turbulent. The illusions break. The compensations fail. The old self crumbles. But in that collapse, authenticity emerges. A person begins to orient himself not by the noise of the world, but by the clarity of his own interior compass. This is the true meaning of the examined life, not intellectual critique, but existential orientation. The tragedy of the digital era is that orientation becomes impossible without deliberate interruption. The world accelerates, reflection slows. The two movements collide. Only one can dominate. If the world wins, the self dissolves. If reflection wins, the self awakens. And yet, awakening introduces a new struggle. For once the self becomes aware of its internal disorder, it then must confront the external world that sustains and amplifies that disorder. Modern life does not reward introspection. It rewards appearance, performance, speed. The examined life becomes countercultural. It demands boundaries. It demands refusal. It demands the protection of one's inner world against forces that seek to occupy it. This protection becomes the next task. For the examined soul must learn not only to see clearly, but to act according to what it sees. An action, once rooted in clarity, enters the realm of ethics, not as imposed rule, but as internal necessity. Thus, the examined life, by illuminating the structure of the self, inevitably raises a deeper question that Socrates placed at the heart of moral philosophy. If one understands the good, why does one fail to follow it? And if one truly aligns the parts of one's soul, how does that alignment transform the way one lives with others and within the world that resists coherence? Autonomy is not granted to the human being. It is demanded of him. The moment one begins to examine the inner life with sincerity, the old moral scaffolding of reward and punishment collapses. What remains is a raw confrontation with freedom. Socrates saw this long before modern ethics divided itself into systems and theories. He recognized that a person does not become moral through fear of consequence or hope for approval, but through understanding. Understanding is the engine of ethical action. Without it, morality becomes performance. With it, morality becomes identity. The individual who has begun to see the disorder within, the fractures between intention and action, the hidden motives that betray his own values, now faces a different challenge. How to live well, not because he is told to, but because he comprehends why the good is necessary for the integrity of his soul. This marks the shift from obedience to autonomy, from external morality to internal authority, from rule following to ethical sovereignty. Socrates insisted that the good is not an external force imposed upon the self. It is the natural expression of a psyche that has achieved clarity. Once the parts of the soul are aligned, reason guiding, emotion resonating, desire disciplined, the individual does not need coercion to act justly. He acts justly because he cannot tolerate the inner dissonance created by acting otherwise. In this sense, virtue is not a task, it is a consequence. Kant would later articulate a similar truth. Autonomy is the foundation of moral dignity. A person becomes ethical not when he follows rules he does not understand, but when he obeys principles he has rationally affirmed. The moral law is not external. It arises from reason itself. Socrates anticipated this long before the language of categorical imperatives existed. He understood that the highest form of obedience is obedience to one's own examined understanding. But this form of autonomy is not comfortable. It confronts the individual with choices stripped of excuses. Once a person grasps why the good matters, not for reputation, not for acceptance, not for advantage, but for the coherence of the self, he loses the ability to justify wrongdoing. He cannot hide behind ignorance. He cannot claim confusion. Clarity transforms freedom into responsibility. Responsibility becomes the weight of knowing. And yet this weight is paradoxically liberating. For the first time, the individual becomes the author of his own ethical life rather than the product of external forces. He chooses the good not because someone commands it, but because he understands its necessity. This understanding changes everything. It dissolves resentment. It dissolves rebellion. It dissolves the infantile desire to transgress simply because transgression signifies autonomy. Real autonomy no longer requires defiance. It requires discernment. The immature self believes freedom means doing whatever one wants. The examined self learns freedom means wanting what aligns with one's deepest truth. But alignment requires courage. Desire must be interrogated. Emotion must be clarified. Reason must be purified of self-deception. Only then does the moral compass stabilize. Only then does direction become inner rather than imposed. This inner direction creates a new kind of strength, one that cannot be bribed, coerced, or manipulated. A person who understands why he must be good is unmovable in a way the rule follower never can be. The rule follower can be tempted. The internally autonomous cannot. Temptation loses power when the self understands the cost of violating its own integrity. Wrongdoing becomes not a possibility, but a fracture one refuses to inflict upon oneself. This is why Socrates believed that a just person is happier than an unjust one, even when the unjust person appears to succeed. External success cannot repair internal division. The unjust man may win the world, but he loses himself in the process. The just man may suffer externally, but he retains his inner order. Autonomy is the source of this stability. It is the quiet yet unshakable authority that arises when a person has taken responsibility for his own soul. Yet the modern world complicates this autonomy. In 2025, individuals are flooded with moral narratives from every direction: political, cultural, social, digital. Each claims legitimacy. Each demands allegiance. Each attempts to shape the individual's sense of right and wrong. In this chaos, it becomes easy to confuse virtue with conformity, ethics with signaling, autonomy with rebellion. The noise of societal morality overwhelms the quiet clarity of personal understanding. Socrates would say, ethics does not arise from the crowd. It arises from the examined self. But to hear this inner authority, one must first separate his values from the values imposed upon him. This separation requires ruthless honesty. Why do I hold this belief? Because it is true to me, or because it is convenient? Why do I condemn this action? because it violates my reasoned principles, or because it threatens my place in the group? Why do I praise virtue? Because I understand its necessity, or because others expect me to? These questions strip morality of its performance. They reveal the degree to which the self has outsourced its ethical life to external structures. The person who has not examined his moral beliefs is not autonomous. He is obedient in disguise. His goodness is conditional. His dignity is borrowed. True moral autonomy begins when approval and disapproval lose their power to control one's conscience. Kant argued that autonomy is the only thing that gives moral action its worth. Socrates lived that truth in his final act. He chose death rather than betray the principles that anchored his soul. His choice was not noble because it was sacrificial. It was noble because it was consistent. Integrity became more valuable to him than life itself, because integrity was the condition of being himself. Without autonomy, existence would no longer belong to him. But autonomy does not mean isolation. It does not mean withdrawing from community. It means entering community from a place of integrity rather than conformity. The autonomous individual enriches society because he brings coherence, stability, and clarity into the collective. He does not mirror the chaos of the world. He confronts it with the order he has cultivated within. Yet autonomy introduces a deeper challenge. Once the individual commits to living according to principle rather than impulse, he must face the full complexity of moral action. Life does not always present simple choices. The good is not always obvious. Circumstances conflict. Values collide. Emotion pushes one way, while reason pushes another. Even within an integrated soul, moral tension persists. This tension is not failure. It is maturity. Socrates believed that the pursuit of the good is endless because the self is always in motion. Autonomy is not a destination. It is a continual practice of alignment. Every decision becomes an opportunity to refine the relationship between understanding and action. One must constantly ask, am I acting from clarity or craving? Am I guided by truth or fear? Am I choosing this because it is right or because it is easy? Such questioning demands vigilance. The world pressures the autonomous self to compromise, to soften, to adapt to collective expectations. But once the self knows that living well requires living truthfully, compromise becomes a quiet form of self-betrayal. And self-betrayal is the one wound that autonomy refuses to inflict. Yet here lies another revelation. The autonomous self does not become rigid. It becomes responsible. Responsibility does not mean inflexibility. It means accountability to the truth one has discovered within. The mature individual does not cling to principles dogmatically. He refines them as his understanding deepens. His morality evolves as his insight expands. Autonomy is not the defense of fixed rules. It is the disciplined pursuit of better reasons. And this pursuit inevitably leads to a larger question. If morality arises from inner order, what happens when that ordered soul confronts a society whose structures, incentives, and values are profoundly disordered? How does an autonomous individual navigate a world where justice is inconsistent, institutions fail, and collective morality fractures under the weight of competing desires? The answer requires moving beyond the individual and into the realm where inner harmony meets external responsibility, where the integrity of the soul must engage with the structure of the world, and where personal justice expands into an inquiry about the nature of justice itself. Justice begins not in courts, laws, or institutions, but in the architecture of the soul. Socrates understood this with a clarity that unsettles the modern mind. He saw that a society cannot rise above the individuals who compose it. A fractured soul produces fractured actions, and fractured actions accumulate into fractured systems. Injustice, therefore, is never merely external. It is the projection of inner disorder onto the world. A person who has not mastered himself will inevitably disturb the balance around him. And when enough individuals live in contradiction, society itself becomes an echo of their internal chaos. This truth destroys the comforting illusion that injustice is something out there, something committed by distant forces or corrupt institutions alone. The real origin lies closer. It lies within the human being who refuses to examine the motives behind his actions, the desires that drive him, the fears that shape his judgment. Socrates insisted that a just society is impossible without just individuals, and a just individual is impossible without an ordered soul. Justice, therefore, is the external face of internal harmony. But the world in 2025 does not reflect this harmony. It reflects urgency, fragmentation, acceleration. It rewards ambition without introspection, performance without understanding, efficiency without meaning. People live under the pressure of systems designed to maximize output rather than wisdom. In such an environment, injustice becomes almost automatic, not because individuals choose harm, but because they are too overwhelmed, too distracted, too disconnected from themselves to perceive the consequences of their actions. Injustice becomes the shadow of unexamined living. Socrates saw this dynamic in ancient Athens, long before it became global. He recognized that when the soul is out of balance, the person becomes reactive. Desire dominates, leading to greed or exploitation. Emotion dominates, producing resentment or vengeance. Reason collapses under pressure, making the individual vulnerable to manipulation. These internal distortions scale upward into political decisions, social conflicts, and institutional failures. What appears as structural injustice is often the magnification of psychic disarray. This is why Socrates linked justice to harmony. Harmony creates stability. It aligns thought, feeling, and action. A harmonious soul does not need laws to restrain it because its internal structure naturally inclines toward fairness. Such a person cannot act unjustly without feeling immediate inner resistance. Injustice becomes self-inflicted injury. Justice becomes self-preservation. But the world rarely recognizes this. Instead, it treats justice as a negotiation between competing interests. Power determines truth. Influence shapes morality. Systems reward domination rather than balance, and individuals caught within these systems internalize their logic. They begin to believe that justice is a matter of advantage rather than alignment. They measure worth through comparison, not coherence. They pursue success even when success fractures their inner world. In this environment, the just person appears naive because he refuses to participate in the games that govern the collective. Yet the deeper naivety lies with those who believe they can violate the integrity of the soul without consequence. Socrates argued that the unjust person suffers more than the victim of his injustice, not because punishment awaits him externally, but because inner dissonance corrodes him. He becomes divided, unstable, unable to trust himself. His desires multiply without restraint. His emotions harden into cynicism or fear. His reason loses its authority. Injustice destroys the one who commits it before it destroys anything else. This insight reveals why justice is not optional for a meaningful life. It is the condition under which the soul remains whole. A person who betrays justice betrays his own structure. He may gain wealth, influence, or recognition, but he loses the one thing that makes life bearable: inner steadiness. Without steadiness, achievement becomes emptiness. Pleasure becomes escape. Identity becomes performance. The harmonious soul, however, becomes the foundation of all external goodness. Such a person contributes to society not by idealism, but by alignment. His clarity cuts through confusion. His stability diffuses conflict. His presence imposes a quiet order on the world around him. Justice radiates outward from him as naturally as light radiates from flame. But here lies the next confrontation. What happens when a harmonized soul enters an unjust world? When a person committed to coherence encounters systems built on distortion, when inner order clashes with outer disorder, this tension becomes unavoidable as the individual deepens in understanding. He begins to see not only his own contradictions, but the contradictions embedded in the structures around him. He recognizes that justice is not merely a personal virtue, but a relational one. It demands action. It demands integrity in the face of pressure. It demands resistance to forces that seek to fracture the soul back into compliance. And this resistance gives rise to a new form of conflict, not within the individual, but between the individual and the world he must live in. The more attuned he becomes to inner harmony, the more striking the dissonance of the external world appears. Institutions built on expediency repulse him. Relationships built on dependency strain him. Cultural values built on distraction exhaust him. He begins to feel the weight of being in a world that does not share his orientation. This is not a call to withdrawal. It is a call to clarity. The just person must understand the nature of this tension if he is to navigate it without losing the order he has cultivated within. He must discern when to adapt, when to confront, and when to refuse participation. He must learn to carry his internal harmony into spaces that do not support it without allowing those spaces to corrupt him. But to do this, he must confront an even deeper truth. Justice alone cannot stabilize the soul in the face of life's most fundamental uncertainty. Harmonized or not, the individual must eventually meet the limit that no internal structure, no moral clarity, no external action can escape. And it is at this threshold where existence reveals its fragility that the soul encounters its final teacher, and the question of freedom meets the reality of mortality. Death is not the end of life, it's the revelation of how we have lived. When the ordered soul confronts an unordered world, when justice within collides with injustice without, a subtler truth emerges. Even harmony cannot shield the human being from the final boundary. Mortality is the one horizon that interrupts every illusion about control, permanence, and mastery. And Socrates, more than any other figure of his time, understood that freedom is impossible until one has learned to face this horizon without retreat. The world fears death because it exposes the fragility of every structure we build: achievements, identities, relationships, convictions. It reveals how provisional they are. It strips from us the narratives we use to stabilize ourselves. But Socrates inverted this fear. He treated death not as annihilation, but as instruction, not as punishment, but as purification. He faced his own execution with a calm that unsettled his accusers, precisely because it revealed something they lacked: inner sovereignty. To fear death is to fear life's unpredictability. To reconcile with death is to reconcile with the limits of one's control. This confrontation is the ultimate test of the soul's order. Reason must accept what it cannot alter. Emotion must relinquish its attachment to illusion. Desire must surrender its fantasy of endless continuation. When these parts align, death no longer appears as a threat to be defeated, but as a teacher demanding recognition. Modern individuals in 2025 are more anxious about death than any previous generation because they are less accustomed to limits. Everything promises optimization, prolongation, enhancement. Death becomes an intrusion into the fantasy of perpetual improvement. It feels like failure. Yet this fear is nothing but a symptom of deeper confusion, the belief that meaning depends on permanence. Socrates dismantled that belief. He argued that meaning arises not from duration, but from clarity. A short life lived consciously surpasses a long life lived unconsciously. Death presses this truth into the bones. The presence of death sharpens perception. It demands that we distinguish what is essential from what is merely urgent. It forces the question: what within me remains when all external affirmations fall away? This question terrifies the fragmented soul because it has no core. But the ordered soul answers without trembling. It recognizes that the only thing death can take is what was never truly ours. It cannot take integrity. It cannot take understanding. It cannot take a life that has been examined and consciously lived. In fact, death becomes the final mirror, reflecting back whether one has lived in alignment or in avoidance. Socrates accepted the cup of hemlock because to flee would have fractured his soul. The danger was not death. The danger was inconsistency. Had he contradicted his own principles for survival, he would have lost the very coherence he had spent his life cultivating. And so he demonstrated a principle that modern existentialists later echoed. Freedom is not the absence of constraint. Freedom is the refusal to betray oneself. The fear of death diminishes the moment the self no longer fears its own truth. When a person refuses to examine himself, death becomes the final enemy because it exposes how little of his life was truly lived. But for the examined soul, death is simply the closing of a circle. It confirms that nothing external ever defined him. His worth did not depend on achievement, approval, or longevity, but on the depth of understanding he brought to every moment. Death becomes a continuation of clarity. Yet there is a deeper psychological dimension to this confrontation. Human beings fear death not only because it ends life, but because it ends possibility. Possibility is intoxicating. It allows us to postpone decisions, avoid commitments, maintain illusions. As long as time stretches before us, we can imagine the life we might one day live, truth we might one day face. Death removes this illusion of later. It demands immediacy. It demands presence. It demands the courage to step into the truth now rather than someday. This demand is the essence of existential anxiety. Not fear of extinction, but fear of responsibility. Death forces us to acknowledge that the only life we have is the one we are actively choosing, moment by moment. If our choices are misaligned, no future salvation will correct them. If our soul is fragmented, no extension of time will unify it. Mortality reveals that procrastinated authenticity is simply a slow form of self-abandonment. Socrates embraced death because he embraced responsibility. He did not negotiate with fate. He entered it with the same clarity with which he entered dialogue. The soul that lives in harmony does not fear the cessation of breath because it has already encountered truth more frightening than death. The truth of its own contradictions, illusions, and evasions. Once those have been overcome, death is no longer the great terror. It becomes a final release from struggle. But this encounter with mortality has another consequence. It reshapes how one lives among the living. A person who has reconciled with death behaves differently. He does not cling. He does not rush. He does not drown in trivialities. He does not fear being misunderstood. He no longer bargains with life. He participates in it fully because he knows its limits intimately. The reconciled soul becomes fearless, not in bravado, but in lucidity. Injustice no longer seduces him because he recognizes that nothing achieved through wrongdoing can outlast the internal damage it inflicts. Ambition loses its tyranny because it no longer masquerades as immortality. Desire becomes grounded because it no longer seeks escape from finitude. Even suffering transforms. It becomes bearable, meaningful, instructive, because it is understood as part of the structure of existence rather than a deviation from it. This transformation is why Socrates' death remains more powerful than his life. It reveals the final consequence of a coherent soul. It demonstrates that the one who lives truthfully dies without regret. And regret, perhaps more than death itself, is what torments the human being who has lived in denial. Yet even this reconciliation is not the end of the philosophical journey. For once the individual understands that freedom lies in confronting mortality rather than avoiding it, another realization arises with equal force. The task of philosophy does not conclude with personal clarity. It extends outward. It asks how one who has achieved understanding must now live in the ordinary world, among ordinary people, in the daily rhythms of work, relationship, conflict, and community. The soul that has faced itself and faced death must now face life again, but differently, with responsibility sharpened, with perception deepened, and with the quiet, unbreakable demand to embody truth in every ordinary moment. Philosophy fails if it remains confined to books, lectures, and abstract debates. Socrates never intended wisdom to be an intellectual ornament. He intended it to be a way of existing, a discipline of perception, a rigor of honesty that penetrates every ordinary moment of a human life. After confronting illusion, confronting the soul, confronting justice, and finally confronting death, the individual must now confront the most difficult terrain of all, the everyday world, where truth is easiest to forget and hardest to embody. For it is one thing to see clearly in solitude. It is another to remain lucid in the noise of human interaction. The examined soul cannot withdraw into purity. Withdrawal is the temptation of those who fear contamination. But clarity is not fragile. The one who has understood himself must re-enter the world precisely because the world is still governed by unexamined impulses, inherited assumptions, and defensive illusions. The task is not escape but participation. Yet participation without self-betrayal requires an internal vigilance that most people never cultivate. Socrates lived among ordinary Athenians, in the marketplace, on the streets, in casual conversations. He was not a hermit of thought. He was a provocateur of consciousness. He confronted people not to expose their stupidity, but to awaken their potential. He recognized that philosophy becomes sterile if it does not reshape the tone of daily existence. The person who has seen truth must now speak truth, not through preaching, but through presence. Presence is the real work. It demands that one remain aligned while standing in the currents that pull others away from themselves. In 2025, these currents are stronger and more relentless. People are exhausted by comparison, overwhelmed by information, seduced by performance. The modern individual rarely thinks, he reacts. Rarely listens, he defends. Rarely questions, he broadcasts. In such an environment, the Socratic figure is not merely useful, he is necessary. He becomes a counterforce, a stabilizing center that interrupts the reflexive momentum of collective unawareness. To live as a philosopher among the ordinary is not to elevate oneself above them. It is to refuse to join the unexamined flow. This refusal takes many forms. It is the courage to ask real questions when others hide behind superficial ones. It is the strength to pause when everyone else rushes forward. It is the willingness to speak honestly when silence would be easier. It is the capacity to hear beneath the words of others, the fear, the longing, the confusion that shapes their speech. It is the discipline to respond from clarity rather than ego. The philosopher in the streets is not a lecturer. He is a mirror. Through him, others glimpse their own inconsistencies, their own evasions, their own potential. This mirroring is not aggression, it is invitation. It calls the other person into authenticity. It challenges them to articulate what they actually mean, to justify what they claim to believe, to examine what they habitually ignore. But this way of being has a cost. The world resists mirrors. People cling to their illusions because illusions shield them from responsibility. A person who confronts truth becomes a disruption to those who depend on avoidance. Socrates discovered this resistance repeatedly. His questions exposed the fragility of civic pride, the instability of conventional wisdom, the emptiness of rhetorical power. And those who were threatened by such exposure did not seek understanding, they sought silence. The philosopher must therefore accept friction as part of his vocation. To live truthfully is to disturb those who prefer the comfort of deception. Yet disturbance is not violence. It is medicine. It awakens the dormant parts of the soul. The philosopher reminds others of the questions they have buried beneath routine. What am I becoming? Why am I choosing this? What matters when everything superficial dissolves? He reintroduces depth into conversations flattened by haste and distraction. He refuses the shallow narratives of success that culture celebrates. He disrupts the complacency that numbs people into mediocrity. But the philosopher's task is not only external, it is also internal. To live philosophically is to remain vigilant against one's own tendency towards self-deception, moral compromise, and intellectual laziness. Clarity must be renewed daily. The soul's harmony must be protected. The temptation to abandon truth for convenience never disappears. The philosopher must therefore treat his own life as an ongoing inquiry rather than a completed achievement. This vigilance produces a different kind of strength, quiet, resilient, uncompromising. The strength to remain honest in environments that reward pretense. The strength to remain compassionate in conversations shaped by defensiveness. The strength to remain curious, a culture that prefers certainty. The strength to remain free in a world that seeks conformity. Yet even this strength is not the final aim. Socrates' ultimate vision was not the creation of solitary sages, but the transformation of communal life through individual awakening. A single examined soul influences more than itself. It sets a pattern. It alters the texture of interactions. It invites others to reconsider their lives, their values, their fears. Philosophy spreads not by doctrine, but by example. The philosopher becomes a catalyst. His presence disrupts complacency. His questions ignite reflection. His authenticity challenges imitation. His coherence exposes contradiction. His calm unsettles the anxious rush of those around him. Without preaching a single rule, he restores humanity to the people who have lost themselves in the machinery of their own routines. And yet, even this transformation does not exhaust the task. Beneath the activity of thought, beneath the struggle for integrity, beneath the confrontation with death and justice and illusion lies a more fundamental question, one that no philosophy can escape. What is the meaning of existence itself when all external supports fall away? What remains when the self has been stripped to its essence? What truth emerges when one no longer fears truth at all? Such questions pull the philosopher beyond ethics and psychology into the raw territory of existence, where the final inquiry waits with its quiet, unyielding demand. The journey always returns to the point it began, the self standing before itself with no illusion left to hide behind. After moving through ignorance, questioning, self-deception, moral struggle, inner order, existential clarity, and the confrontation with mortality, we arrive not at a doctrine, not at a system, but at a condition of being. Socrates' legacy is not a set of answers, but a way of inhabiting existence with vigilance, honesty, and unyielding commitment to truth. Reminds us that philosophy is not an escape from life, but a deeper entry into it. To examine oneself is to recover the authority that distraction, fear, and imitation have stolen. To question is to break the inertia of unconscious living. To seek the good is to refuse fragmentation. To face death is to strip life of its illusions and see what remains essential. To live among others with integrity is to carry clarity into a world that has forgotten how to see. And so the path he opened is not a historical curiosity. It is an ongoing demand. It calls for the courage to confront one's own mind before confronting the world. It calls for the discipline to refine perception until action and understanding become one. It calls for a life where truth is not an abstraction, but a lived posture, where the soul becomes its own compass, and where freedom is not granted by circumstance, but forged through consciousness. In the end, Socrates leaves us with a stark but liberating truth. The greatest revolution is internal. When the individual becomes transparent to himself, the world changes in the only way that truly matters. The noise loses its power. The illusions lose their grip. The self stands upright, not because it is flawless, but because it is awake. And from that awakening begins the quiet, unending work of living, not as a spectator of life's movement, but as a participant shaped by clarity, anchored in meaning, and guided by the unwavering demand to remain true to the deepest part of one's own being.